Alrighty, looks like we might be live and alive. Fantastic. So, hello everybody, and welcome back to the show. We're doing a continuation of what we started yesterday. We didn't get very far into it, so I figure we'll probably only get to one video again this week because that just seems to be how it is going. But we are working on our kind of analysis of potential pseudo-intellectualism and kind of the issues of even anti-intellectualism that I see cropping up from pseudo-intellectualism. In the meantime, if you have any questions, by all means, feel free to jump on in, free to examine what I'm saying, challenge it if you will, but we're going to be taking a look at Peterson. Now, there is a way, I thought there was a way to pop out video players. But I'll be damned if I can't figure out how to do it anymore. Because I don't really need any of this extra stuff. I would just like a nice video player frame that I could pop out, make bigger to an extent for my again, I can't it's there. I know you can do it. I just can't for the life of me figure out how. That's a premium thing. Maybe they locked it behind premium, something like that. Either way, we have a debate here between Richard Dawkins and Peterson, and in the center is Alex O'Connor, who's kind of being the moderator between this. So we have a debate on, in this case, Christianity. This particular section is probably talking about cultural Christianity and which is good or bad. Richard Dawkins is a standard atheist, fairly classic kind of a liberal atheist, and Jordan Peterson is not. I think he would, for the most part, fall well into the cultural Christian as being the better form of society. I'll be honest. I've seen enough of Jordan Peterson's stuff to be somewhat iffy on what exactly he seems to be aiming for, what his actual goals are. But let's just jump straight into it. The long form debate here. Again, this is always there's whenever you're doing atheist versus Christianity, some of the things that are going to be coming up is this is a very much it's a fraught philosophical argument because it's very easy to slip between is and oughts, between what is or did not exist and what is or what should and should not exist. So it's one of the things where it ranges from moral arguments to existential arguments, and then back to moral arguments because because in many ways the existence, the proposition from the religious side is the existence of a thing, X, God, whatever it is, hell, kind of precludes and otherwise it prescribes a certain moral lens, prescribes a specific moral perspective that has to be kind of calculated into the math. Whereas the atheistic side, again, because those things do not exist, other concerns, they're more focused on kind of cause and effect to a certain degree rather than some kind of a priori or some kind of existential marker of good and evil. Now, Peterson's not your traditional Christian, but I'm not sure if that's a good thing or a bad thing. So let's just watch and see what we get.
That I found very interesting.
Well,
You made a statement a couple of months ago that I found very interesting. And I don't claim to understand it, and I'm not trying to put you on the spot with it. You said that you were a cultural Christian. Okay, and so that raised a number of questions in my mind. And the first question was,
You
Well,
are changing the subject. You're
no,
not.
I'm not. No, I don't think so.
Okay.
I may be leaping outside of the topic a bit to
We
get
can
back
do
to it. But
cultural Christianity, but I think, because I have a list of questions that you wanted to ask, and that is one of them. But I
well,
think Professor Dawkins did
you were
ask you.
referring to the predictive power and to the utility of the
quantum, yeah,
stories.
yeah, yeah.
Okay, so that's actually what I was trying to
Okay,
zero in
fine.
on.
Go ahead.
Okay, so that was the point. Well, it seemed to me that your proclamation that you were a cultural Christian was a recognition and a statement that you had found something in the culture that had been derived from Christianity that you had an affinity with, and that there's some reason for that. And one of the things I wanted to ask you is, well, what do you think that Christianity got right that allows you to make a statement like that? I mean, I know that there's differences perhaps in what we both think about the ultimate veracity of the biblical stories. Maybe there isn't differences. Like, it would take a lot of conversation to figure this out. But what did you mean by that? Like, what do you think that Christianity got right that would enable you to make a statement like that?
Virtually nothing. I meant by that no more than that I'm brought up in a Christian culture. I went to Christian schools. I therefore know my way around the Bible. I know my way around the Book of Common Prayer. I know the hymns. That's all. I don't value Christianity as a truth system at all.
Okay, so let me ask you about that, because maybe that's true and perhaps it's not. So the first question is, like, do you think that there are any marked differences between cultural traditions that would enable you to rank order them in?
Okay. So to get at here, so his question, Peterson's question, is what did he mean? What did Dawkins mean by saying he was a cultural Christian? In that he believes, or based on that statement, he made the assumption that Dawkins believes that there is some kind of moral correctness and or efficiency, goodness to the Christian perspective as far as a way to live. Okay. So that is not a bad assumption necessarily to make. However, it does seem to miss kind of the point of what, and again, this is often the case, is that the Christian right tends to always want to find the either some degree of hypocrisy and or win condition within the atheistic movement, i.e., you say XYZ about Christianity, but you live according to these rules. Ergo, you are Christian, and you are simply resisting the thing that you already agree with, and this is not true. It is a form of hypocrisy, form of this self-deception. And usually, not always, but fairly commonly, the issue, is some form of spell today. Hypocrisy. Ignore the terribleness of that. See if I can. Nope. Not very fond of this. Hypocrisy, but also a degree of inconsistency. Again, in a debate, this is not a bad place to go. But this always seems to be a offshoot of an even older kind of Christian style, is that atheism is a form of deviance. That's a terrible deviance. I don't like being this zoomed in. I'm not sure if it's going to work out too well. Maybe this will help a little bit. That hypocrisy just keeps getting killed here. Deviance and or kind of a madness, a complete and utter flaw. Now, on the opposite end, we're also going to see this with the atheist arguments or atheistic arguments against the Christians, is that it is a delusion or illusion or some kind of aspect. So this is not bad. This is a fair question to ask to a certain degree. It does seem somewhat off topic. So again, the moderator nicely comes in here. That's why he came in there, is because again, when you're having a actually properly moderated conversation, I know this is somewhat strange to hear, but when you're having a properly moderated conversation, the moderator is actually going to be involved quite a bit more. The moderator is more like a referee. Think about how often a referee is doing stuff in a game or making calls in any kind of game system, whether it's a soccer, hockey, basketball, calling for traveling, for rough unsportsmanship, football. There's flags always. They're always moderating, keeping things within the boundaries and checking stuff. That is what a good moderator does. So him inserting here again, some people might kind of be like, oh, hold on, you're jumping in. Why is the moderator jumping in? They're just trying to have a conversation. They're not having a conversation. This is a combat of words and ideas, and he is the referee who has to be there to ensure that everybody's playing according to the rules of this particular game. All language games. So go back here a little bit.
Back to it,
Cultural Christianity, but I think, because I have a list of questions that you wanted to ask, and that is one of them. But I think Professor Dawkins did ask you.
You were referring to the predictive power and to the utility of the stories.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's actually what I was trying to zero in on.
Go ahead.
Okay, so, and again, he's bringing this up as far as predictive power. Basically, the argument is that the value of a system is based upon its ability to correctly anticipate and predict and or otherwise give counsel to the individual or the society on what is the most efficient or right way. Efficient way to live that leads to better results. However it was. Okay. So this is why he's asking the question.
That was the point. Well, it seemed to me that your proclamation that you were a cultural Christian was a recognition and a statement that you had found something in the culture that had been derived from Christianity that you had an affinity with, and that there's some reason for that. And one of the things I wanted to ask you is, well, what do you think that Christianity got right that allows you to make a statement like that? I mean,
so again, this is going to be one of those differences on how one uses the term culture, or I'm culturally X or Y. Now, it's interesting that oftentimes I find within certain academics or certain kind of argumentative positions, and this isn't exclusive to Christian positions, but in this case we'll do this, is there's a certain degree of kind of this weird assumed pride or ownership. Where Peterson goes wrong here on this initial thing is that he assumes, because he puts forward Christianity as a guiding principle, blah blah blah, all that kind of stuff, and more importantly takes great pride in the culture in which he is currently engaged in, that there is not just pride and ownership, but there's a kind of, because there's so much pride and ownership of one's culture, and you are so involved in it, and you're so aware of how good your culture is, or how your culture is telling you, and you're putting all your eggs in your one basket, saying, my culture does this for me, and that's why it's good, blah blah blah, is that there's a bit of, and he's gonna bring this up in a second here, a hierarchy or a rating system, which goes back to the value thing. It's oddly very capitalistic, which people can always kind of argue back and forth with. But there's a very much a pride of one's culture, and it is taken as a culture is a thing objective reality. Now, what I might mean here is objective reality, which means that it is self-evident. It is something that existed or that exists outside or without extreme control or even manifestation of people. This kind of goes back into, especially with when it comes to cultural Christianity, but they're marrying the two things, is that as God exists, that means that even if no people existed at all, theoretically Christianity exists. Even if there was never any people, the Abrahamic God, the whatever you would call him or her, but mostly him, never ever created the heavens and the earth, never ever created man. Even without that, there is still the kernel, the core of Christian existence as being a correct method of way of life. It's just there's nothing there to live the life of Christianity, but it already is there. It is an objective thing. And culture, and especially they see this as Christianity influencing culture. Africa, my culture is, again, it's not quite as objective as God, but it is one of those things where it is a natural process. It naturally springs forth. The culture in which I live in is a culture informed by Christianity, and that culture, by virtue of Christianity, must be righteous and good and true and correct, like the answer, like H2O, like water was always H2O. It was always made up of hydrogen and oxygen atoms. Always, even before we had even if we never came up with the language to say H2O, it is still made up of the thing, the objective reality of what we would term hydrogen, and the objective reality of the thing we would term in our language oxygen, H2O, and it is in that formation, and we simply need to discover it. Simply find these things. These things are already pre-existing. We just find them. Now, this is... I'm trying to think about where actually... Hold on. I just noticed the dinosaurs in the background here. They're... Seen those. They're in Arizona, I'm pretty sure. Part of the reason why you can always tell it's Arizona is that if they're in America and you see saguaro cactuses, they're these big old trunk-like, tree-like cactuses, saguaros. It's probably Arizona. They're technically, I believe, they stretch into New Mexico, and some in Texas, and some in I think has some, but some of them have been planted. But the natural range, the majority of them do tend to show up in Arizona, southern Arizona, and some of New Mexico, and I think a little in Texas. Kind of the very southwestern scene. So usually, on average, if you see a saguaro, it's in Arizona. Sorry, a little aside. I'm just trying to remember where those Allosaurus T-Rex things are. Anyway, so the objective reality. So it is a discovered culture in many ways. Is that we are discovering that which was already there. So as we make advancements and alterations even to Christianity, oftentimes the cultural Christian or the heavily influenced Christian who believes that Christianity is the righteous culture. Their excuse for this of why our new form of Christianity and Christian culture is different from previous ones is that, like Revelations, is that it is being revealed to us, much like how the New Testament was a revelation of new order, new rules. Old rules, some of the old rules stay, but a lot of them go away because we have new rules. So the new rules are applied to the reality. So we are discovering. So it's kind of an odd way to it's again anti-evolutionary thinking in that, again, you're not evolving, you're simply discovering what was already there. And again, God is always there before you get there. And thus Christianity is always there. So this culture, the culture that they live in, oftentimes becomes this kind of this artifact, this little shibboleth, this little, psychological and conceptual objective thing. So whenever somebody, says, oh, I'm culturally a Christian, they're assuming and believing that, well, that statement to me automatically means, or indicating that you found value, effectiveness, hierarchy, and you take pride or control of this, which some atheists may take to. But again, as Dawkins is probably going to point out here relatively quickly, this is not the way in which he and many atheists are using the idea of cultural Christian.
I know that there's differences perhaps in what we both think about the ultimate veracity of the biblical stories. Maybe there isn't differences. Like, it would take a lot of conversation to figure this out. But what did you mean by that? Like, what do you think that?
So here's an interesting example of, I'm not sure if I call it pseudo-intellectualism. It is borderline pseudo-intellectualism in Jordan Peterson is this comment right here. It would take a lot of conversations and whatnot. Is this idea that they take it, I want to be careful because I don't want to be mean on this point, because this is somewhat true and somewhat not, is that they look at the way in which rationalism, science, and kind of the humanistic experience, this academic idea of, again, you have to gather up a lot of information and a lot of time and a lot of effort to make any kind of hard statements of fact. Our scientific method, the idea is, again, you can't just observe one thing and go, oh, hey, I interviewed one person, they said this, ergo that must mean that everybody believes this. Like, no, we're based upon a probability scale. We are based upon a large number generation, to where when we generate large numbers of a particular fact or factoid, that is more likely that the factoid is something generalizable, because it is something that we can see in large numbers, in large data sets. And again, the other pursuit is that, again, academia is constantly in conversation with itself. It's constantly in conversation and debate with itself, and constantly going back and forth and back and forth. So Peterson often will do this, is that he kind of argues the unknowable factor, in that because there is no absolute certainty in any kind of statement, we're never ever 99%. He always takes that as a indicator, or seems to always argue as an indicator, that because we can never ever reach 100%, we must we're always at the mercy of this 1%, or we're always at the mercy of the unknowable God within the gaps kind of aspect. And the way he deals with this in an argumentative manner, which I'm not particularly fond of, is that he makes these assumptions and he covers a lot of his assumptions up with this idea that, well, I'm sure we agree on many, many things, but maybe we don't. But the only way we would be able to discover the ways in which we disagree or even agree is through an extreme, uncalculable amount of conversation. It's not in an absolutist kind of manner. That's not incorrect, but it also seems to be somewhat anti-intellectual in the sense that it basically, without meaning to, negates any ability to communicate ideas at all, because the consequence is that unless we literally talk to each other day in day out for 40 years, we can never ever know anything. It goes back to this weird, almost instinctual, self-evident thing. So the only things that we could ever discover, the only things we could ever make any kind of statement on, because everything else we could ever analyze or think about or hypothesize on and make a thesis about is always going to be less than 100%, are what he would term as self-evident existence things, objective reality. But then that objective reality, he's including a lot of subjective things and including a lot of stuff that has massive assumptions, but he doesn't believe they do. And it ends up in this kind of annoying factor where he's constantly saying, well, it's always this weird argument anytime he wants to get defensive or even offensive, is that he basically attacks, well, you can't know something for not 100%. Gravity isn't 100% proven, so therefore you cannot say gravity exists. And this is the argument he likes to do, is this kind of argument to the absolute absurd, or the argument to this unknowable factor. And basically the flaw in human thinking, or just a feature of it, leads to kind of at least for me, nothing has meaning except whatever he determines is not subject to these rules. Despite the fact they all are going to be subject to these rules, somehow there's always something, usually Christianity or something, that not subject to the rules. And his argumentation for these things oftentimes is less than satisfactory.
Christianity got right that would enable you to make a statement like that?
Virtually nothing. I meant by that no more than that I'm brought up in a Christian culture. I went to Christian schools. I therefore know my way around the Bible. I know my way around the Book of Common Prayer. I know the hymns. That's all.
So again, this whole line of thinking has an issue for Peterson, because again, as Dawkins pointed out, what he means when he means is that culture is not divine, not essential, that was terrible spelling, not essential to knowledge or knowledge statements. It is a factor, perhaps, certainly. Essential to reality. Again, he tends to take a much more scientific kind of approach, or whatever is that, and we could argue some difficulties with that approach, but in essence, again, culture is not divine. It's not essential to reality and knowledge claims, and it itself is not a knowledge claim or a value claim. But essentially, it is simply a claim of historical existence. or biographical, and even and for him, he might even be a what's the word I'm looking for? Well, an admittance of a potential bias. The only reason I mention this is because because my culture is not essential to reality and factual statements of reality and knowledge claims. It is something that could potentially have bias, and thus, when I make my statements, the check and balance on me, in the sense that when I say this or acknowledging this, or somebody else needing to acknowledge this, is that somebody else who might not be culturally Christian, who is trying to find reality in knowledge statements, who's trying to find the objective reality, may need to take into consideration that, again, not being a perfectly logical individual, and having, again, the basic flaw in the nature that we are reflective of the societies we grow up in, all aspects of it, even the nonsensical, the non-logical. We are a sponge. We soak up all of it, whether it's we're soaking up water or piss or oil. We kind of soak it all up. So there may be contamination. That would be, for the most part, again, Dawkins's kind of approach to a certain degree of this. Again, it's not, I'm probably not saying in such negative terms or whatnot, but again, this is at most simply an acknowledgement. He doesn't mean any value statement on this, one way or the other, which we could say is a flaw, because I think one of the reasons why you should acknowledge these things, even if you don't use it as like a whip to, chastise yourself with and self punishment. Oh, I'm sorry I grew up in this culture. I'm sorry I grew up with this. But it is something to acknowledge that this could affect your ability to perceive and to interact with the world and your assumptions and your calculus. This could do so. Could not, but as a good scientist, as a good rational thinker, you should account for all variables. That is what Dawkins is doing. Now, again, Peterson wants to glom onto this because, again, his system is a little bit different. At least sometimes he wishy-washes back and forth, and again, he ends up sounding. He probably would hate this. He ends up sounding way more like a caricature of postmodernism, with oftentimes his, well, what can we know? Well, what does that mean? Well, how can we know this way? So this is an issue.
I don't value Christianity as a truth system at all.
Okay, so let me ask you about that, because maybe that's true and perhaps it's not. So the first question is, like, do you think that there are any marked differences between cultural traditions that would enable you to rank order them in terms of their ethical?
So again, Peterson loves his hierarchy. For good or ill, this is just almost as this is his philosophical thing. If you wanted to boil down, if you wanted to think of him in as a philosopher, boil them all down. All philosophers tend to have a thing, or at least one or two things. Sometimes they have multiple because they'll switch as they go through their career. But something like Foucault, Michel Foucault, French philosopher, his big thing can be perhaps somewhat inaccurately summed up as power or power dynamics. That's a lot of what his philosophy ends up talking about. And again, he deals with other topics here and there, but oftentimes these topics are all kind of usually under the umbrella or touching upon or elaborating on one of his central concepts of the kind of power of society, the power of culture, the power of certain systems on the individual, on social things, and how social construction is done through power, the maintaining of power, the use of power, the abuse of power, all that. You could do this with other philosophers, and again, I wouldn't say it's always going to be inaccurate to say a philosopher only talks about X. Rarely what actually happens, but there is a strong theme. His theme for Jordan Peterson is, for the most part, at least one of his primary themes, is always hierarchies. Is that he's always assuming a hierarchical system. He's always assuming that the hierarchical system is objective and also understandable and also an indication of value. The reason you are at the top is because you are better. It's a kind of a weird evolutionary psychology, evolutionary objective reality, and I think oftentimes there's he's putting too much weight in the idea that because you're at the top of the hierarchy theoret, whatever the hell that fucking means, being at the top of it, that must mean that you are special or good or better, gooder, more moral, whatever it might be, or you are more fit for the environment in a value system, which could be true, but more often than not, it's just like, it's not necessarily like you can actually have systems to where an objectively shitty thing is at the top of the hierarchy primarily because it doesn't require a lot, and it can use all systems, but it's not, it doesn't produce a lot, it doesn't do a lot. I don't know. You could imagine this, but again, Dawkins is not saying it's a value system. And again, the thing that Peterson also does that's somewhat annoying, he doesn't say this, but it's basically the implication here with this point is that essentially he's saying, well, you say that, but what if you're lying? And it's kind of an odd thing to where he doesn't seem to stake out a position oftentimes when he's actually arguing with people who know what they're talking about. Instead, he kind of does this weird round argument where rather than actually going at the point, he kind of circles it. And with implications, so that anytime you try to pin him down as what you actually are saying is this central little thing that they're circling around, that's clearly you're drawing this shape through your argument. He can then kind of say, no, of course I'm not doing that. That's you just assuming I'm doing that. But even if I was doing that, which I'm not doing that, the fact that you assumed or were able to acknowledge that proves that the thing that I'm arguing on must exist because you saw it and you're acknowledging it and resisting. Like it's this weird kind of circular reasoning mixed with a bit of like odd gaslighting and odd like vague non-statements that are actually statements. It's a thing that I'm not particularly fond of.
I went to Christian schools. I therefore know my way around the Bible. I know my way around the Book of Common Prayer. I know the hymns. That's all. I don't value Christianity as a truth system at all.
Okay, so let me ask you about that, because maybe that's true and perhaps it's not.
Maybe that's so. Again, he wants to present that, okay, well, he has an argument that like, oh, I actually think that you do. It may be unconscious or whatever, but you are using this as a frame thing. I would much prefer a direct statement direct versus indirect argumentation. Now, the indirect can be useful because it's somewhat similar to like the Socratic method, where rather than making the statement or directly stating the idea, you instead ask questions and allow the person to come to this. It's a very teacher-orientated thing, which is fine. However, there's a degree of, weird to say because I am a teacher, was for more than a few years, and something I do quite a lot, and I still do, but there is a power dynamic issue here that I am iffy on, and it comes to do with a certain degree of respect. Like, if I am talking to a student who is based on the position, based on this thing, while I might assume, and I can make the assumption that I know more about this individual, about these topics and ideas, I simply do. I know more than they do. That gives me a certain degree of power and prestige and whatnot. And I should not abuse it, but I also shouldn't ignore this. I should not necessarily treat this individual as they are perfectly equal to me in this knowledge thing, because they aren't. Now, this is more of a stylistic thing, but the indirect kind of argumentation style, the almost Socratic method style of kind of negging. Honestly, it doesn't really sound like Socratic method with Peterson. It sounds like he's kind of doing this weird negging, if you're familiar with that relationship term. Feels more like that. But I would not necessarily take this route unless I had a really good rapport with somebody of equal. That's a big thing. Unless if I'm talking to somebody who is also a master's student or a master's or a PhD or somebody clearly very knowledgeable, my assumption is that this person has knowledge of equal value to me. So and this is just maybe a personality thing, I would find that I would avoid going too Socratic, too kind of teacher, student, master, whatnot kind of role, because one, if they're aware of this issue, they're going to know I'm not actually. They're going to immediately spot the X, and there's a degree of frustration. Like this, look, I know what you're talking about right here. So why don't you just, instead of trying to teach me a thing that I already know, why don't you instead say what the thing is and move on? And maybe once we get into more higher level stuff, or we can get, like, it just feels a little bit disrespectful sometimes for somebody to be talking to me, or I'm talking to somebody else who is of equal knowledge, who can make, at least to some degree, equal knowledge claims, and you're kind of faffing about. That's an issue that I have with Peterson, is that he seems to do this philosophical navel gazing, um, despite the fact that oftentimes the people he's talking to have already gone through and done all that, and they're way beyond this level. They're way beyond it at this point. So the idea that you're just gonna, like, wow them with these strange navel gazing games, so I guess, no, I've done this before. Why are you throwing this weak ass shit at me? If we want to even think of it from a debate standpoint, why are you throwing this first year philosophical bullshit at me? I've done this shit. Don't go about here. If you want to say, hey, I think you're actually wrong about this, just say that. Just say, well, from my perspective, the way I'm going to see this, and my argumentation is that is wrong, that you are actually very informed. In fact, you utilize and oftentimes rely strongly on this. That might be obvious because, well, that's your position, but stake your position out. That's fine.
So the first question is, like, do you think that there are any marked differences between cultural traditions that would enable you to rank order them in terms of their ethical validity?
Yes.
Okay, so here's the thing that I also find that modern Peterson does a lot more, is modern Peterson, maybe I'm just too sensitive to this, or I spend too much time psychoanalyzing things, but man, is he aggressive. Why is, again, he's just too aggressive for my taste. There's just a level of weirdly accusatory, like, again, these aren't people, like, he doesn't seem to treat his opponent as a rational human being whose path, whose knowledge claims, whose considerations, conceptualization, and whose answers are worthy of some degree of respect and um and I don't know, worth. Even if they're wrong, this person has put labor, time, effort, energy, life into this, and if you respect life to a certain degree, it feels like you just there's this weird, like, accusatory, I think you're wrong. And again, for somebody, again, he doesn't say the line, but what if you're wrong? Okay, I can be wrong, but is wrong lying? Is wrong evil? Oh, even according to the Christian thing, it's not evil or wrong. So why are you so aggressive about attacking them? And it is kind of a weirdly attack. Now, again, this is a debate. It's fine. It's just something that, again, sometimes I feel like he comes off too hot. Now, this could be in the middle of the conversation. It's highly likely. So I give him a leeway. Just something to point out is an issue that I find with pseudo-intellectualism is that oftentimes, as I said before, it is highly aggressive and highly defensive whenever it is forced into the intellectual marketplace. It will cheat, steal, and undermine because it knows its product is inferior. At a core, it knows that its product and what it's selling and its overall thing. So it'll do the Microsoft, it'll do the Apple, it'll do this thing to where when it's confronted with a superior product, rather than getting better with your product and improving, instead what it'll do is it'll buy up the company, destroy it, dismantling it. It'll call the police. It'll have Uncle Tony come by and firebomb the place, because we don't want competition in our neighborhood. There's this degree of destroy the other that I just not keen on. But let's listen to Dawkins' answer here. He answers rather quickly. And again, Peterson is once again on his hierarchy kick. Is there a way to evaluate them? Have you done an evaluation of all your of these various faith systems or faith culture systems? Is there a way to evaluate them? Have you created a hierarchy?
That would enable you to rank order them in terms of their ethical validity.
Yes, I do.
So for example, we could contrast mainstream UK Christianity with Islamic fundamentalism.
Yes.
Okay, so there's a hierarchy.
There is a hierarchy.
Okay, a hierarchy that points to what?
Well, in the case of Islam, I dislike.
I'm not sure I get that. Like, he says that, but it's actually a rather weird question of hierarchy pointing to what. Now, again, his assumption is that the hierarchy is pointing to the objective thing. So you are discovering God. Again, that's what he kind of means by that. That's where he's kind of going with this argument, is to, you will discover God.
Any religion which punishes apostasy with death, that throws gay people off high buildings, that practices clitoridectomy, that seems.
So the value system that Dawkins seems to be doing here is basically, and in this case he's talking about fundamentalist Islam, but we could also apply this to, is that anything that is that he's looking, the value of a thing is derived from its observable objective actions, consequences, And more importantly, responses to nonconformity. Now, this last one is probably a fairly useful one to understand. Is that, again, notice most of what he's talking about is all of the bad things are things that are what makes a religion or a culture less hierarchically valuable, or lesser on the hierarchical scale, is its ability to allow for nonconformity. If it does not allow for nonconformity, hence, if you are a homosexual individual, are you allowed to exist within there? Are you an apostate? Are you a non-believer? Are you a nonconformist to this particular thing? Now, we can argue back and forth whether that is actually good or not, because some people might say that a culture that has no actual face cannot exist. But the big thing here is this idea very much is tied to once again, even though he didn't say liberalism necessarily at this point, we could even derive how we know this is a liberalist argument, is that all of these things are about whether the values that he's talking about, or the bad values, the things that devalue a culture, is how much does it restrict the liberty in the liberal mind? How much does it restrict the ability for the society to function in nonconformity? And this might be, again, itself somewhat useful, because then we could also see this from an evolutionary aspect, to where diversity is a useful trait to encourage, because it allows you to have more traits that may be positive, may have beneficial things depending on the change to the environment. It's hard to become the fittest for an environment if you don't have the traits to be fit to it. So there's like a core aspect there. So
To me, to place Islam on a lower level than Christianity, but that's not to say anything very positive about Christianity.
Well, it might be to say something positive about Christianity. Like, I think that question is open, because you might ask yourself, what did Christianity get right that led it away from those particular presumptions and towards something that you regard as more ethically appropriate? Like, this isn't a trivial question.
It's a very modest claim. There's not very much. I mean,
so again, it's not a trivial question. It kind of like it actually kind of is, because as Dawkins is probably going to go here with, as with his modest claim, is that it's kind of like saying you are the least shittiest of the shitty. Like, you, from one perspective, you could see that as being important, but again, this seems to it's a weirdly editorialized perspective of Christianity, in that it ignores the centuries and centuries in which Christianity was not particularly correct, and was barely above. So, like, oh well, what about Christianity made it, has made it better than fundamentalist Islam? The question you might go is, well, seeing how they both were extraordinarily barbaric for 1,000+ years, the question then goes, well, why didn't it happen earlier? If Christianity is this, why didn't the revelation of these values happen earlier? Christ died in what is it, 32 CE, Common Era? I think if we use the Common Era now. So what is it, like 32, 36? I can't remember the date, the year he died. But if we were to take that and, okay, we'll add a few centuries of thought necessarily to deal with his revelations, with the concepts of New Testament and the writing of it, which is, again, probably going to be hundreds of years. So, okay, let's give it up to like 500 Common Era. How come Christianity, okay, well, it's living in brutal times, so it has to respond to the brutal times of other things. Like, well, that's kind of So it's only ever as good as the rest of society will let it be. I'm not sure if that's a I'm not sure if the hierarchy is really useful then, and I'm not sure if Christianity is useful, is that it's always going to be held back by the lowest common denominator. It'll only ever be as good as the lowest common denominator of cultural or religious evil that exists outside of it. So as long as there is extremism of another faith, Christianity can't rise above that. Again, they might not be arguing that, but this is one of the consequences of trying to think about, well, why didn't it come earlier? Why didn't it happen earlier? Why didn't we see uh, rights for gays, lesbians, the LGBTQ community? Why didn't we see this pop up earlier? Well, the flaws of man. Well, again, if the flaws of man are so easily overcoming the objective reality of this, then again, I'm not sure if you're making a strong claim for Christianity being this. More importantly, again, Christianity, thought, and ideas were explicitly used to persecute these things for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. So again, if I have a sample of two plants or something like that, they're both similar but maybe different. They're the same family but different little bits, different subspecies. And they do X. They both produce X for thousands of generations. It's over and over, hundreds of years. They're both producing X result. Sometimes one produces a little bit more, sometimes one produces a little less, but for the most part, they're all pretty equal. And then, after many, 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 many generations, within a relatively short 1 to 2 generations, I'm going to see one plant stop producing as much X and start producing Y or different results. I'm not going to go, well, that plant must have had something essential in it that made it different from the other plant. Not going to necessarily assume that. Now that could be true, but part of my investigation, I might also, honestly, I'm going to assume, well, I've had these things generation after generation after generation, hundreds and hundreds of years of back and forth, and it's always producing X. Now this one is producing Y. My question would be okay, either something fundamentally changed about the plant and thus it is now producing Y, or it has to be, okay, that's an assumption, something has to have done that. So was this an internal thing that was always present, that was finally activated, and then we'll leave that for now? Or was this an outside thing that came and infected it and caused it to change, like a environmental change, something like that? And maybe it brought out recessive. Maybe it was able to change because of recessive things. Maybe it was able to change because the outside thing was literally gene manipulation. Like it literally added gene code to this. It's either coming from the plant or it came from outside of this system. And I would have to put weight on both of them. And I might even put more weight on the thing coming outside of the system. Because if it was internal, I would then be looking at throughout the history of this, and I would be wondering, like, if this has been a normal day, this day, this year, this temperature, this whatever has been the same for hundreds of years, why now? Why not yesterday? Why not 10 years ago? Why not 100 years ago? Why now? That would imply, to a certain degree, not 100% certain, but to a certain degree, that there must have been an external thing that caused this. Even if the genes were recessive in the plant to not produce X, but to produce Y, then something new in the environment, something I did, something external must have caused the recessive Y genes to come out, which means that, do I value the plant and its ability to have Y in it, or should I actually look at, well, should I look at the thing that caused the Y recessive genes to come out? Because maybe that's actually the method rather than the while the product is really nice, the thing that I might want to focus on is what produces that product. Because maybe if I take that thing and focus on that and make that the priority, even though I like Y, I make the priority of what creates Y or what makes plants create Y. Maybe I can take that and say that is actually the good value system. Maybe that has a value. Maybe that is the actual important thing, and take that and apply it to the plant that is still producing X. And then we have it produce Y. So this is kind of the fundamental thing. And again, this is an issue here that I'm not sure if Peterson's going to get.
To be better than a religion that throws gay people off high buildings is not really a very virtuous achievement.
Yeah, and again, like that's the issue is that, again, this oh well, Christianity is no longer throwing homosexual individual, gay individuals, the LGBT community from buildings. It's not doing these other extremist things. It's like, well, okay, great. But the problem is that we have many other value systems that are secular, whether it be kind of value systems of liberalism or socialism or something like that, more political and or socialized humanistic ones that don't really have as much of a history of throwing people off buildings and doing horrible things, and has already got tons and tons of you should do X. There is no need to filter these things. We should be doing these good things. There's no need to have to interpret it incredibly strangely, because even if maybe Christianity helped get them to this level, it's very clear that it's not really keeping up. Is that the moral and ethical landscape of the world, of societies, and the need of societies, and the need of different moral and ethical rules, regulations, and understandings, and the expansion of it, that Christianity may not be keeping up. Survival of the fittest. It may be that Christianity, when we look at other religions, is the top of the food chain, but it might not even break top 50 in the world. Just because you're the best Smash player in your friends group doesn't mean you're shit on the pro scene. But oh well, you need to value my gameplay and you should respect me. No. If we're doing things based on like a hierarchical thing, then the reason why we might not be doing Christianity much anymore is because it's just simply not viable. That's a question. That is the idea.
I don't know. I don't know if that's true, because if you look at the barbarism that characterizes the human past, you might think that any progression whatsoever towards something approximating mercy and tolerance is nothing short of a bloody miracle.
Okay, so this is again another thing he's going to say is bloody miracle, is that he always likes to do this scare tactic of the past horror. And because if we look at the past horror, basically, if we look at from, in many ways, he wants to look at it like a graph here. And if this is overall goodness in the world and time, like we look at this graph here, like this, again, what we might say is like, well, he's looking at this like this rise from here to there. That's a big gap. This rise here, boop, 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 boop. It starts at near cratering that. And if you only ever look at that, you always ever compare this point in time to this point in time in a relation, you see this big old gap right there. You're like, wow, that's amazing. That's great. So Christianity, Christian good, oh my God, like any improvement at all is amazing. It's just like, yeah, but See, this graph is actually deceptive because here is what we might look at as the actual graph. Computer getting a little bit laggy there. I'm not quite. So this is goodness in the world. Time. The graph more looks like this. So he wants to say, well, Christianity has been here forever. So the Christian growth from this point to this point, I mean, any advancement, even this little rise right here to this point, I mean, that's a bloody miracle. Bloody miracle. Look how terrible. It's like this, yes. But one thing you're missing is that during this time, during this brutal time, as it's gone through, we're all very brutal. And yet Christianity was present the entire time and didn't improve anything. The majority of our improvement, when you think about human rights 6,000 years ago or 4,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, during the pyramids or shit like that, or after that, think about the Roman Empire, the Greek Empire, thinking about the Egyptian empires, anything else, Ottoman empires. You think about all this, and what were the rights of people? Did we have slavery? What were the rights of slaves? The economic systems, the power differentials, the ability to hold people in power accountable, basic human rights, all of that. Again, think about this. Like, we got labor rights in like the UK and Ireland and whatnot. The initial bits of labor rights for children, so child labor laws, came about in, oh God, it's like early 1800s, I want to say. Child labor laws was 1938, and America was the earliest. Let's see. The earliest stuff we're going to be seeing is, let's see, 1904. Yeah, that sounds about right. Again, these are not great, but these are small steps in the right direction kind of thing. Labor, oh man, I spelled this shit out. Labor laws. Child labor. All right. Well, pre-industrial industries, we had it for a long time, and we still had it for a very, very, very long time. Industrial revolution. And the Victorian era were really bad for this. In Britain. Let's see. You can read all about all the horrible conditions. Again, child labor practices were dreadful. God, they were awful. But I know one of the big movements was William Blake, the poet. He was part of the movement, and like famous poems like The Chimney Sweeper and stuff like that were part of the social and cultural movement to get labor laws passed because of the horrible nature of it in the UK. I just need to look that up. We can do something like this. I'm trying to remember when they were passed here. But yeah, William Blake, he was writing his Chimney Sweeper. Child poverty. Yeah, it would be late 18th century, early 19th century. And again, the printed one, but again, they were somewhat instrumental to pushing forward child labor laws and whatnot, early forms of child labor laws back in the UK. So when we look at that, like, let's just say it starts around the Industrial Revolution. is when we got lots of bad China, but we also had stuff happen before that, like the Magna Carta and basic rights of people. So even if we go back to, okay, let's just say the beginnings of civil rights and rights of people around 1600, just say something like that. Or even later, like, again, within the last 200, 300 years, like 80% of the ethical and moral advancement of rights, privileges, decency, humanitarian laws, war crimes, uh, protections, rape laws, everything happens within the last, what, 200 years? 200, say 250, 300 years. So Christianity has existed, if we want to take it in the old form, like of Judaism and the old Christianity, even though it's not Christianity, it's Abrahamic, has existed for thousands and thousands of years, for like thousands of years, 2,000 years plus, 3,000 years. And the only good has happened within the last 300. My thing would be like, okay, I don't really think whatever was existing here, this point here, whatever was existent here or dominant to right about here, I'm not sure if this really had a strong moral value, because there seems to be absolutely no advancement under its cultural domination. It's culturally dominant within these areas, and we don't see a strong what I'm more interested in is this right here. If we've had a dominant moral value system from this point to this point, from the beginnings of this, and we only saw this much of advancement, but then somewhere around 200-300 years ago, we see the beginning growth, and over 200 years, we have a huge growth, comparatively over time and space. My question then would be, my assumption and my thing is that I kind of doubt this stuff here, whatever was here, is responsible for this, because if it is, we would have seen it earlier, most likely. We would have seen summarized. We would have seen something. So something here, and this just so happens that when you start looking at it, it's like this, well, where do we start seeing? We start seeing more humanistic values. We start seeing a move away, and maybe we always had these things. Maybe they were always present, and we finally created conditions through industrialization, through mass production, through a relief of some of the extremity of and the need to produce food and sustenance. So now that we have that, well, the stress is taken off from us. We can act less barbaric and animalistic, perhaps, certainly. But then that would mean that the key to unlocking morality, even if the morality is within Christianity, it's not within Christianity. The key's not there. The key is something else. So maybe we should spend more time focusing on how we make that how we can make that key again, or keep doing that, how we can unlock more value out of Christianity. But it's not going to be looking at it necessarily. Like, we can analyze and study what's there, but it doesn't seem like it's ever produced it without an external key unlocking it. And he's got this scare tactic of the past horrors of the reality, and it was so bloody awful. It's bloody, bloody, bloody awful. Just absolutely bloody, bloody brutal. And it's like, yes, that's true, but this is one of the things where, like, yes, back in 2000 BC or BCE, things were terrible, but I'm sorry, I don't give a shit. Maybe I'm living in too much of the present of the world or whatever, but I only, like, 200-300 years, maybe 400 years, I'm willing to give you, as far as a time frame here. But it just seems to be like, well, you should be happy with what you have, because 500 years ago, peasants weren't even paid anything. You barely got anything. So why shouldn't you be so utterly? It's like, yes, I should be, but the standards have raised. I I don't start off life here and then go boop, 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 to here. I start life off here. And yes, maybe this is a small thing, but in this small little circle, we may see massive amounts of turns or whatever. And again, this might be the entire lifetime of a person or 40 years of their life. These are massive changes. The idea that, again, it just seems to kind of this weird reduction through this. You broaden your scope out so far that you reduce all questions that might go against your grand narrative. There's a grand narrative here, and the questions that go against it are reduced to meaningless things because, well, it was way worse in the past. I'm not big on this.
Miracle.
Well,
Like people are pretty ruthless, and so are our chimpanzee cousins.
yes, they are.
Right. So
Yes.
Why do I care about the chimpanzees' cousins? We are not cousins to them. We haven't been we're cousins to them, but we haven't been cousins or connected or any way, shape, or form to them for quite a while. That's the point of evolution, I suppose. But just because you observe that, it's just this weird. I don't like it.
So we move forward into the light with great difficulty, and the fact that we can take that for granted now, and that it seems self-evident.
Who is taking this for granted? It seems self-evident. It's not self-evident. That's actually the opposite. Is again, like I know he's kind of using this as kind of like a weird gotcha for like, you don't realize how good you have it today. But that's kind of pointless because it's like, yes, but here's the thing. Just because 200 years ago my life and existence would have been more miserable, doesn't mean this is just an argument for just being happy for what you have right now. This is actually this is that part of the reason why we have so much advancement is not because people were constantly going, well, in your 1800s, oh, the child laborers, you're terrible. Well, back in the ancient Egypts, they were slaves. You should be happy, little Timmy, to only be working a 10-hour, 12-hour shift at the coal mine rather than a 24. You would never be allowed to stop back in the day. The reason why we have this advancement is because we are so short-sighted in many ways. You can make that argument is that part of the reason is because we want to better things for ourselves or for our children. And that is, in a relativistic standpoint, a very short time, which means that we need to get shit done. Being satisfied, being happy with where I am, or more importantly, being terrified of returning to a past. So I don't want to lose anything. And all I want to do is maintain the absolute status quo for fear of the past that this does not lead to advancement. This just leads to a paralysis through fear.
And deserving of faint praise. It's not so clear to me that that's a reasonable proposition.
Okay, let's grant the faint praise, but that has nothing to do with the truth value. And what I care about is the truth value. I see no truth value in the claims of Christianity, the virgin birth, the resurrection, the miracles. Do you believe in any of those? Do you believe Jesus was born a virgin?
So again, he wants to work with truth value. So again, that's important because again, these are different things. You can look at a value system for its overall good of what it's done, but in many ways, we remember where this was originally talking about, though it seems to have gone off the rails or gone somewhere else or gone muddied in this great time scale that we are constantly going to, is that I think even Peterson was the one to ask us, is the value of the predictive model here of Christianity, both predictive and prescriptive. Now, it seems like, again, Dawkins wants to talk about the predictive aspect, not necessarily the prescriptive. Okay. Both predictive and based upon its veracity. I think I misspelled that. Based upon its veracity or its verifiable nature, its truth claims, and if its truth claims are good and logical, then we might be able to build upon those truth claims to truth predictions. And in fact, we might even do that instead. Predictive truth, which is very kind of weird to say because truth is something that is factual or whatever, but so if you're predicting something that has not been proven true just yet, but some degree of predictive truth. And that's where he's going here. And then he wants to get into kind of, again, the classic atheistic thing is the facts of the Bible. You know, the Bible makes many claims and many statements of fact or truth, such as virgin birth. So he asks him, do you believe in the virgin birth?
As I said before, there are elements of the text that I don't feel qualified to comment on. My experience has been that the more, like I know from a metaphorical perspective and from a mythic perspective what the story of the virgin birth means.
So here's and again, this is a perfectly fine way to go. And this is one thing that Jordan Peterson will occasionally do that I think is valuable, though sometimes he does employ it, I feel like, in somewhat of a cynical manner, is basically he's somewhat willing to admit to a certain degree, I don't know. This is useful, but it also can be problematic because it's kind of a weirdly, I don't want to say weaselly, but a weirdly, it can be somewhat cowardly, is that if I don't know how to, like, say, I don't know how to play basketball. If someone will ask me, hey, you want to play some basketball, shoot some hoops real quick, and I just happen to be there, I don't know how to play at all. And I might say, I really don't know how to play or whatever. And then and then the person goes, oh, we're not playing serious or even like a pickup game or anything like that. It's literally just, we're just going to kind of be half-assing this a little bit, just kind of shooting, passing the ball with each other. Maybe you try a little bit of blocking me and I'll try a little bit of blocking you, but you know, we're not playing this like an actual pickup game or whatever, just kind of some play. So it's less stressful, and more importantly, I know that my failure is not going to reflect terribly upon me, and that they're not going to hold this against me. It is simply a play. I will absolutely play. And even if it's more serious, I might still play. But it is perfectly acceptable as that, like, look, if you're asking me to do this because you are genuinely, like, you need my knowledge, or you are asking me to represent something here that I'm not 100% good on, I don't feel comfortable representing my side to make these arguments because I'm not knowledgeable enough. This is perfectly humble and perfectly fine to do. However, if the question, or if this statement or the idea here is not really, I'm not looking for you to answer once for all. I'm just asking you for your personal opinion, your ideas on this. Then the refusal to play is more of a dodge. It's more of a, I do not want to be accountable for my belief. And it can come off as a bit problematic. But I don't want to, I'm not going to harsh on him too much on this, because this is a fair thing to say, is that I'm not studying on this. What I do know, like me, like I may not know the historical factual nature of many things, but like him, I'm more with my background in English and critical theory and literature analysis and stuff like that. I know more about like mythological, symbolic, and kind of language and narrative and narratology, and I know more about that stuff than I do science and tech and all those things. I will still engage with conversation about it, but again, I think it's perfectly fair. I would still try to participate because they did ask me to play. I just might condition it by like saying, look, I'm not an expert on these things. And I don't know the general explanation of these things, but I can say for like me, I don't really believe in X, Y, or Z, but I believe in the value of the belief in that, because even if the factual nature of it is incorrect, the result of the belief of this is correct. That may be bad ultimately, but maybe that's the way in which you could take this. Again, I don't know, but the lack of engagement is not bad. But it is something that he has used in the past to kind of dodge accountability for this. Like, you want to argue in favor of Christianity being here, but it's like, okay, well, you want to argue Christianity as being this multi-purpose all theory of all that I can apply to it everywhere. The problem is that if I'm a scientist, biologist, chemist, I can't apply it here because it is anti-science, anti-factual. Either you can acknowledge that and go, okay, well then it's more just a moral culture value system and it's not something factual and scientific, or you have to argue it is, and then we got more problems.
And I accept that. I know, for example, that any culture that doesn't hold the image of the woman and infant sacred dies.
Do you mean
And I don't know how that needs to be expressed in a
Is
form.
it true, though?
do you mean that you don't know?
Well, let me ask you about that, because truth, this is something I talked with Sam Harris about too. Truth, as we know, is a tricky business. Do you think there are differences in the truth claims between different writers of fiction? Like, is Dostoevsky more profound than?
Well, I wouldn't call fiction truth claims anyway. I mean, these are...
Then on what grounds do we rank order the fiction in terms of quality? Like, Dostoevsky is a profound purveyor of fiction on the philosophical front, unbelievably deep and profound.
Yes,
There's something true about what he's writing about.
It's nothing to do with the truth that science is concerned with. The truth of science is the truth that gets us to the moon. I mean, this is nothing to do with whether one writer of fiction has a sort of insight into human nature. That goes without saying. I accept that.
Okay, so how do we deal with the notion that on the purely factual side, how do we deal with the idea? Let's take you talked about clitoridectomy. Let's talk about the
Okay, so we're jump around a lot. I'm not sure if this is edited, but this is really jumping on topics across the board, and I'm not. It is Peterson's fault. He's jumping around a lot. So the distinction here that seems to be the problem is we're talking about what we might term as an objective truth versus subjective truth. So Peterson wants to go into the value of culture, or more importantly, the value of stories and mythologies, in that they produce material objective results. So the subjective truth, feelings of this, the meaning that is created, the psychological and cultural meaning of the belief, or cultural meaning of this fiction, like Dostoevsky or whatever, and their insights into human condition, the subjective human condition, produces some degree of objective truth because we act upon what we think and we feel. That is not a terrible argument to make, I suppose, and again, it's a valid idea to think about, but again, it's kind of, again, they're arguing past each other. Is that is again, Dawkins is talking about the objective material truth and the necessity of that for science and all of those things. So again, the fact that, again, and his argument is that if we believe in magic, if we believe in virginal birth, then we don't land on the moon. That sounds kind of silly, but it kind of makes sense when you think about it, is that if you believe in non-reality things as being reality, then you then you end up with so much false information that, again, you have to wade through the bullshit to actually do something, to make it an actual thing. So if I was, sorry, I'm messing around with something here, fidgeting, like, what is lightning? Where does lightning come from? If you believe and hold the belief that that Zeus story true, that Zeus does this, then you don't come up with like electrons, you don't come with like static charge, you don't come up with the idea of particles rubbing together that creates some degree of static discharge that does it in the clouds as they're rubbing together, and it creates a big old lightning bolt. I don't remember how lightning is necessarily created. Again, I'm not a scientist. But you don't end up with this because the objective truth and the subjective truth are kind of muddling together, and the subjective truth is in many ways overriding the objective problems if you're in this belief system. So this is kind of arguing past each other. Now, again, it is a tricky subject, so I will give some degree of Peterson that, but I think he's actually making that trickier because, again, he wants to talk about basically anything but what Dawkins is touching upon. And again, these knowledge claims are really vague and kind of particularly difficult, because he wants to see, okay, is there truth in fiction? Well, theoretically, from an objective standpoint, no, never. There is insight, there is thoughts and feelings that may mimic other people's thoughts and feelings, but thoughts and feelings are not necessarily truth responses. They're not evidence of truth. What they are is evidence of a response to a truth, a response to a material objective reality. My feelings of pain are a subjective fiction that my brain has put together into a meaningful, conscious experience based upon the objective signals of electric signals and bioelectric signals of my nerves going to my brain. So this is, again, consciousness is going to be the a big issue there in how we conceive of these things. So this puts it into again a muddled area. We are very muddled now, mostly because of Peterson. Because, again, Peterson,
With the truth wouldn't call fiction truth claims anyway.
now, and again, and fiction oftentimes doesn't make, again, truth claims. Again, this is the muddying also of language, is that the idea of truth here is the problem in what we're talking about. Again, Dawkins' kind of perspective is that truth, in this sense, is very much more valuable in seeing it in the objective sense, because that gives you a grounded reality to respond to, rather than a subjective, an emotional truth that is passed on, that is highly, again, subjective, that is highly modified and changed and done in very potentially strange and odd ways, whereas no matter what, H2 is always H2O. Unless you add things to it, but those things are objective reality things. There is that water boils at this temperature at sea level. If we go up and down, it boils at this temperature, but it is always, for the most part, a static thing, as long as we are able to account for all of the objective things that are happening around us, the air pressure, the temperature of the air, what are we talking about? Like the moisture in it, all things that can interact with all objective realities that interact with other objective material realities, allow us to do things. So again, he's very much, again, doing the science. That's his focus. So he cares about that. And for him, the Bible's mythology is not quite so important or even detrimental, because the mythology pretends to be objective truth, or it creates a blurring of the lines to where the objective and subjective are up for debate to a certain degree. Again, the fact that Jordan Peterson won't even make the epistemological or whatnot leap to saying that the virginal birth didn't happen. That barring any extra evidence, again, he might be going, well, I'm 99% certain it didn't happen, but because there's 1%, I just can't make a conclusion. This seems somewhat useless from a science and from a movement standpoint. Again, we weren't 99% certain or 100% certain that children should have rights and labor rights and be protected. We weren't 100% certain that we shouldn't be able to work a child 10, 12 hours in a factory floor at this point. We weren't 100%. But we were pretty certain. And we were willing to make the leap, and we made the leap, and it was better for it, based upon our objective and even subjective and relating our subjective truths to an objective reality. Because we had that objective reality to reference, we made a choice, and it worked out pretty well. Sometimes it doesn't work out pretty well, but that doesn't mean you just don't act. Jordan Peterson's just not acting, or just this refusal to play, is again creating this tension, creating this problem to where, again, we're just spinning our wheels because we're just not going anywhere, because there is no objective reality that it seems Jordan Peterson is willing to accept, at least in this moment. And this is odd, because then he wants to talk about hierarchies, which is now a value system. But again, how can you trust your value system or the hierarchical list if you don't have anything grounded? If it's only ever grounded in your own personal thing or your own cultural moment, it seems less valuable.
I mean, these are...
Then on what grounds do we rank order the fiction in terms of quality? Like Dostoevsky is a...
So this is another kind of thing that's very, very frustrating, is on what things do we rank fiction. This is very much a non-literary... this is showing his ignorance of kind of the literary studies and just kind of English in general. This is often something that is asked of me by students. They'll ask me, what's my favorite book? They'll ask me, what do you think is the best book or the most moral book or something like this? They ask me, and that's... There aren't really hierarchical literary things here. And more often not, again, the people who are doing this, this is schlock jock crappy listicle 10 books that will absolutely change your world, number 7 will shock you kind of bullshit. This isn't academic. This isn't intellectual. This isn't grounded in good solid understanding and philosophy. This is just this is just kind of fun things. And again, this is personal opinion, and when you make it, again, it is only useful as like this: hey, I have a personality, and maybe there's a cult of personality that surrounds me, and if you want to be like me, you can read and like these books. And if that doesn't sound like a great value statement for morality or ethics or education, it's not. It's dog shit. Now, we do rank, not necessarily in order of ranking, but we do recognize value. We just don't really do the ranking part here necessarily. Now, and the ranking is not necessarily a objective reality of its value that is always true for all times. It's more of influence. It's more like oftentimes when you look at the literary canon, what you should read, it's not so much that because this is better than something else that was written at that time period. It's because this one got popular. Popularity does not mean good. It just means popularity. Sometimes it's because it happened to hit at the right moment, rank, luck, whatever it is. But this idea, and again, this is something that, again, Peterson does not understand. And this is where I really get frustrated with him, because he starts stepping into my fucking wheelhouse and starts muddying up the carpets, and he starts tinkering around with shit that he doesn't understand and doesn't seem to respect enough to know that he doesn't fucking know what he's talking about. And that pisses me off. Sorry, I'm getting heated here. But again, when we create the literary canon, which again, there's tons of arguments back and forth of what should be and should not be included in the literary canon, and whether or not we should have a literary canon. The idea is not so much, this isn't really a value statement. This is more simply an acknowledgement of, like, acknowledgement of an objective material reality, is that this book was popular. People read this book and read the fiction in here and read the subjective truth or feelings and subjective things that were in this fiction, and they used it to model their existence. Did this produce good results? Sometimes, maybe not. It's hard to, that's when that's a question that is really difficult to answer, and oftentimes not particularly useful to answer. Because if I don't because it's, nobody knows. That's a calculation. There's too many variables. We can't say this did one thing or the other. But what we do know is that from a historical standpoint, from an influence of other books, because people write about what they read and use what they read oftentimes and how they write, from a simple fiction world things, that these things are influential. That doesn't mean that they're better. I don't know what the fuck that means. In fact, oftentimes we will find, and again, Jordan Peterson probably doesn't realize this, is that a lot of the books that we think of being incredibly influential were themselves at the time not influential. They were made influential because we went back studying them. Somebody found one, found it really, really interesting, did some reading and study on it. It's like which art is more valuable. Like, both sometimes it's based upon the immediate popularity of it, but also sometimes it is, for lack of a better word, purely manufactured by one academic who wanted to study this, and because of cult and personality, because of like the art world, you think about the art world, it's like, well, why is this painting by this new guy worth $10 million, but this painting here is worth $100? Some of it's literally just market manipulation and creation, is that because all of the experts want to make money off of this painter, they now say this guy is great and awesome and amazing, and they own paintings by him, and they say you absolutely should buy this. So then all the other people who are following these culture critics, these cultural priests, are going, well, okay, it must be true, so I will buy it, and then they get value from it, and then it becomes a circular feeding frenzy, is that because people are buying it, rich people, and because academics are doing it, other academics and other rich people will buy it and whatever. And then by doing so, you create popularity, which then kind of like a self-perpetuating machine, it now powers itself. But it started out under basically just a almost like an investment firm's speculative investment here. It's speculation. It's just, hey, I think I might be able to make this seem interesting enough that people will create value by putting value into it. It doesn't have intrinsic value. Well, you gave it value by putting value into it. Time, money, energy, effort, intellectual thought. So this idea that, again, and he really, really hangs up on this thing because it's really impactful on him. That's great, but he doesn't realize that he's talking about his own individual subjective fucking experience, and he's trying to make it like an objective reality. I'm glad that you read Dostoevsky and were revolutionized by it and really impactful. That's great. I like him. I haven't read a ton of his stuff. And I've read mostly, oftentimes, bits and pieces because I just don't have time to read everything I could ever fucking want to read. But I like what I read, and I think it's great, insightful, and really, really awesome. He's a fantastic writer. And again, those are all value statements, which are, again, I understand, are incredibly subjective. So even when we say that, again, we have to understand that our systems which we are using to evaluate it are really buggy. We still use them because they're fun shorthand, but They're buggy.
Profound purveyor of fiction on the philosophical front, unbelievably deep and profound.
Yes,
There's
but
something true about what he's writing about.
it's nothing to do with the truth that science is concerned with. The truth of science is the truth that gets us to the moon. I mean, this is nothing to do with whether one writer of fiction has a sort of insight into human nature. That goes without saying. I accept that.
Okay, so how do we deal with the notion that on the purely factual side, how do we deal with the idea? Let's take you talked about clitoridectomy. Let's talk about the oppression of women.
Yes.
We make a scientific case that that's inappropriate? Or is it a case that we're making on some other grounds? Like I see in the Judeo-Christian tradition, one of the earliest pronouncements is that both men and women carry the image of God, both. And that sets a certain tone to everything that follows. And it is a remarkable proclamation given its radical age, that both men and women carry the image of God and are to be treated as something with intrinsic value outside of the domain of power and politics. And it isn't obvious to me, having thought about this a lot, how we deal with that in the pure realm of fact. Because one of the facts is, if I can oppress you, why the hell shouldn't I?
Yeah, my job is to keep things on track here. I think there are a number of
Yeah.
questions which Professor Dawkins has asked quite directly that we still haven't really heard an answer to.
Okay.
So, yeah, I'm glad the moderator is coming in too. So again, whether or not the oppression of women can be the oppression of women, it being morally bad, whether that can be reached through a objective or subjective system. That's not a bad argument. And again, the thing is that this is one of those areas to where, again, they're kind of somewhat talking past each other, though this is somewhat, you could get some points to Peterson to some degree. I'll give him a little bit, because again, oftentimes many of the changes that you might have seen here were coached in the language and the ideology of Christianity, but it is, again, it's Christianity plus something. The big thing that is kind of missing here is that's terrible. Let me rewrite that. It is Christianity plus, in this case, what? Because we had Christianity this entire goddamn period. So what is the plus that now makes it so that all of the recessed genes, the recessed good, just going to write that out, the recessive good, what reveals the recessive good? Now, maybe now this is a conversation that maybe Dawkins doesn't necessarily want to have or is not prepared to talk about, because what he's talking more about is, again, in this case, we were talking about cultural Christianity and we're talking about what that kind of means. But again, Dawkins is talking about, or at least trying to engage with, the reason why he doesn't really want to have the Bible stuck as this hierarchical meaning, the central text for meaning creation, is because of its factual misunderstanding, at least in one area. And again, this is the issue that I see with some degree of pseudo-intellectual pursuits, or even when you have an intellectual, they can fall into pseudo-intellectual problems, is that there's always this kind of muddy thought system happening here, to where everything is, when somebody wants to just talk about a specific element, yes, it is only one part of a whole. And you always want to go, well, we have to see this in the context of the whole. That sometimes is useful, but quite honestly, especially when it comes to conceptual stuff, it is very useful to, like, look, we might need to understand it is not, I don't need to, it's not necessarily relevant how a hand works to know how a foot works. Even though a foot is a part of the body, again, it is not, we can see to some degree influence maybe something like the heart or the circulatory system, the nervous system, something like that. But if we want to look at the mechanisms of weight distribution, we want to look at this, again, we might broaden out here and there to more the general ideas here and there to get a bit of perspective. But the issue that I find that is happening with Peterson is that he goes constantly into, again, the abstract, the general, and there is no specificity. There is no like, okay, I'm willing to play the game. Like technically, like in soccer, it's imagine like soccer and somebody refuses to not use their hands. Well, I can use my hands. My hands are perfectly good for hitting a ball, are they not? Well, yes. And we have many other games where, like volleyball, you hit it with your hands. Yes, you can do that. So, and again, the mechanisms, what's the real difference? Both the foot and the hand, they're both extremities. They both have digits. They both have joints and knuckles. They both can grasp things. Like, look at our monkey cousins. They can grasp them. Look at them. Their hands, the chimpanzees, their feet are like hands. And ours, yes, they've changed, evolved, but we're still very much connected to them in so many ways. When I kick a ball with my foot, I'm kicking it with a hand. So therefore, I'm using my hand. Why can't I use? You would immediately go, well, okay, this person is just being obtuse and annoyingly, like, yes, I understand. Part of the thing we want to develop is, yes, we're not using our hands, partly to emphasize the feet, the leg work, the body work, the mobility, the balance, all of these things. We're not using our hands. Yes, I understand that we might use our hands elsewhere, like in boxing. We're going to use our hands, but you don't get to kick me or knee me in the fucking groin. You play by the rules of the game. We're trying to agree to this because, again, we can't do everything all at once everywhere. So we're going to agree to try to focus very specifically on one thing. And honestly, the Jordan Peterson and that kind of this weird new age kind of pseudo-intellectual kind of waffling bullshit has a really hard time just actually being on task. So the moderator's trying to get him on task here.
And Professor Dawkins asking about the virgin birth. You started talking about metaphor, you started talking about myth. I think anybody listening to this conversation will understand that maybe a society that doesn't believe in the virgin birth won't work. Maybe that's the predictive power that you're talking about. But I think you must understand that when Professor Dawkins is asking you, do you believe that Jesus was born of a virgin? He means something like a biological fact. And by the way, saying I don't know, or saying, you know, I'm not qualified to comment, is an answer to that question. But is that your answer, that you don't know?
I said earlier, and I would hold to this, is that there are elements of the text that I don't know how to, that I'm incapable of fully accounting for. I can't account for what the fundamental reality and significance of the notion of the resurrection is. My knowledge just ends.
Sure.
So this is where, again, what we need to do is we need to kind of do a bit of psychoanalysis here and look at what he's saying here.
Comment is an answer to that question, but is that your answer, that you don't know?
I said earlier, and I would hold to this, is that there are elements of the text that I don't know how to, that I'm incapable of fully accounting for. I can't account for what the fundamental reality and significance of the notion of the resurrection is. My knowledge just ends.
Sure, but
I know that whatever happened as a consequence of the origination and the promotion of the Christian story was powerful enough to bring Rome to it.
Okay. So, sadly, this is what he is saying when he's saying that, is I don't know enough to win or dodge effectively. I don't know enough to somehow I don't have the language, the rhetoric. I don't have a planned set narrative. Because in many ways, again, there's kind of many argumentation. You might think of it as kind of there's a narrative, there's a plot line, a theme and plot to your argument as you go through it. He doesn't have the story in his head. He doesn't have it. I don't know how to explain this in a way to win, which that's fair to a certain extent, but for the most part, it's not particularly intellectually honest. Is this: we're not asking you to win, we're not asking you to lose, we're asking you to participate. Again, this is kind of one of those things where, like, if I it's like refusing to shoot. Well, I don't know enough to know how to shoot the basketball when I'm playing the game. If I'm playing with somebody else, they're just going to kind of just find, like, well, you have to like to just try. Like, I get it, but like, try. Because we're playing the game right now. Yes, I know how to shoot, or like, I don't know how to block, so I don't want you to shoot because I don't know how to block you effectively. So I don't want to deal with this idea of you shooting because I don't know how to block. This feels like, well, okay, like you're weirdly cutting out sections of the game because you don't know how to do that particular action or part of this language game, of this interaction, this communication. So, tough shit might be kind of my response. Like, well, that too fucking bad. Try, and then if you come up with something better, I don't know, maybe we'll have a second discussion and you can bring it up. But like, this weird thing to, like, I need to have a perfect response. Like, it's a little, it is annoying and unhelpful for the development of this conversation. I don't know enough. And then he goes into, well, but I do know is that it was impactful. Now, impact does not necessarily indicate truth or anything. Now he's going into this weird psychological, sociological, cultural study of the thing, and taking the fact that this was very culturally significant must mean there is some objective truth. That's what he does with the bringing up of Rome.
The notion of the resurrection is my knowledge just ends.
Sure, but
I know that whatever happened as a consequence of the origination and the promotion of the Christian story was powerful enough to bring Rome to.
Whatever happened of the origination and the proliferation of the Christian story was powerful enough to bring Rome to its knees. Again, we're hyperbolic language that is not useful for this moment of bringing Rome to its knees in the Roman Empire. But here's the thing. Does that mean, again, this is one of those things where he's like, oh, not quite begging the question, but he's assuming the point. He's assuming and inferring a truth without ever actually having to defend it, because he's saying, well, this was really popular and things happened. In many ways, it's almost a causal link, is that X happened, then Y. Therefore, X must have caused Y. But also, he's assuming that because X caused Y, that must mean that there is some kind of fundamental objective reality truth that supersedes all subjective experiences to X. Because nothing else could have done this. Maybe, but it seems to be, again, a little bit kind of iffy to do, because we've seen this happen actually with other cultures and other religions to a certain extent. Maybe not to this expanse, but part of the reason is because we had the empire, so anything that would happen because of the Roman Empire to the Roman Empire is going to have a disproportionate effect by just virtue of being there, of, it, Rome already doing it. So I don't, and again, this is just it goes back into kind of a weird, odd, might makes right and might makes objective existence right, or something like that kind of argument that I'm not keen on, and I don't appreciate, and I don't think it has a good solid foundation to it.
Its knees and demolish the pagan enterprise. So there's some power in that story that's remarkable.
Let's stick to the virgin birth.
Yes.
Yeah.
And, well, the virgin birth results from a mistranslation of Isaiah. You know that.
Like these sorts of questions. What would you say? They don't strike me as they're not getting to the point.
I know
The
that. I
story
know you
has a
think that.
purpose.
Yes.
Well, and look, I understand that there's perfect reasons to debate this. I know that, and I know that your question is more than valid, but it's beside the issue as far as I'm concerned, and it's partly because, well, when we started this conversation, I said, for example, that it appears to be the case that a description of the structure through which we see the world is a story. We see the world.
So I'll deal with that topic for a little bit, but again, this argument of, again, you want to argue about the issue of cultural Christianity or something like that. You want to, again, you have an answer, you have a solution, and you're working backwards from that. You want Christianity to dominate because you, and then you're working backwards from that, and you want the conversation to come to this conclusion. You only want the conversation to be held within the little box to where you are correct, and only that information goes into there. This is, and again, I think it's just meaningless. Like, okay, maybe it's important. Like, again, he immediately tries to undermine himself by saying he doesn't want to talk about it because it's not important, the virgin birth. But then he realized, well, hold on a second. Scientific and material reality is actually important. So me saying this sounds kind of bad. So then he wants to say, oh, well, I understand this is kind of important, but I think it misses the forest for the trees is the idea he wants going for. It's like, maybe, but again, it seems odd that, again, when we look at the specific things, like your argument seems to be that we should look at the whole because the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, which implies that there is some kind of extra thing in there. But again, then people want to look at, well, I want to challenge that. Let's look. And I think the sum of the parts, I think there's an illogical gap there, and I don't really want to do that. I don't want to think. My value system has changed to where I want the sum of the parts and the whole to match up, or to at least have some degree of matching up. And more importantly, I want to do this because it may be that certain issues that still exist is because of the specific summed numbers. There might be some flaw somewhere in the summation that the whole misses. The whole, you're saying, again, unless you're assuming the whole is perfect as is, then it seems perfectly fine to examine the specifics, but he doesn't want to do that. He wants to kind of go into this narrative kind of story thing, which, again, that's fine, but I don't think Dawkins is that it seems odd to be, you're going to be discussing that with Richard Dawkins. And not somebody who's more of a narrative focused individual. That's fine. I would talk about the narrative, and I still think he's going to be wrong about this idea of looking at it from a narrative standpoint. But I do believe, not wholly, but I do believe in some degree of narratology, the idea that ideology and that human mind structures and our concepts and how we think and react to things is influenced, not controlled, but at least influenced to a degree by a narrative-like aspect, a story, cause and effect. We have rise and plots. We always tell our existence as a sequential timeline of events that is very story-like.
Conversation, I said, for example, that it appears to be the case that a description of the structure through which we see the world is a story. We see the world through a story. And so that's a remarkable thing. That's a remarkable discovery, and it's emerged probably in the last 60 years in multiple disciplines, because we have to prioritize our facts. And so we prioritize them according to a particular pattern. And there are patterns that seem to work and to propagate themselves properly and to orient cultures towards life abundant. And there are other patterns, the pattern of Cain, for example, that lead to absolute bloody devastation. And I don't know exactly how to construe that sort of truth, but we talked about the oppression of women, for example. It's like, how do you make a case on purely factual grounds that women should be treated as equals?
It's a moral question, and
I know that's exactly.
And I was dealing with a factual question, which is, did Jesus have a father? And you won't answer it.
Well,
It's a
Jesus
different
had
kind
an
of
earthly
question.
father and a heavenly father, like almost all mythological heroes.
So he wasn't born of a
So again, it seems this is again where we're starting to get into less acceptable pseudo-intellectual or less acceptable forms here. Is again, Jordan Peterson doesn't seem to want to think that there is an is-ought distinction or that this is worthwhile to engage in. Again, Dawkins is focusing on the is. What is a thing? Whereas Peterson is more focusing on the ought, or again, in more modern language, is what should be or should not be. And again, the fact that neither one seems to be playing the other game, but considering the fact that I think uh, I think Dawkins was the one taking the lead and asking the question. He did ask the question. We're stuck here. Like, he was playing to some degree with the culture or whatever, but then he made a statement that, again, I don't really care about the cultural aspect. I care about the is aspect. In many ways, that's what he was saying. Is I care about you're talking about the like the cultural subjective experience. I'm not quite so certain on that. I'm only caring about that in regards to the is moment here. What is and is not something? Was Jesus born of a virgin birth? Did he have a father or did he not have a father? Now, Jordan Peterson's response is a narrative, mythological response of kind of the subjective experience, the narrative experience of, well, you can interpret, the father as, the father is God, all these things. So yeah, he had a father, but again, it's just like, well, yeah, but here's the problem. The metaphorical father is, yes, we know that from the story. What Dawkins is asking is, we know one of the things that Christians often use, and even cultural Christians, to as support for the Bible's veracity and the truth claims in there. Maybe Jordan Peterson doesn't do this too much, but one of the things that is key to this is that, as we know, Christ, based on what we know, the general evidence, did exist. He was a real person who really died. Now, all the rest of that story, whether or not he rose or whatever, again, there's less factual stuff. But the things that we do know, and these are oftentimes victories or things that Christian apologists and Christian arguers use as victory points, is that, yes, Christ did exist. He wasn't a fictional figure. He did exist. And if he did exist, and our story is true, that means that God exists because Christ died and then was risen. Then that cannot happen in a normal material reality unless there's the extra special sauce of, God. So the thing is like, okay, yeah, but the mythological part is still the weakest part. So let's poke a hole in the mythological part, is what Dawkins is trying to do, or at least examine something. Is that, did Christ have a father? Because if you again, do you believe this based on the evidence that you have? Again, this is where faith in the issue is going to come into play, and lots of problems going to stem from this. But this does lead to, like, look, a lot of your thing is based upon metaphor and kind of storytelling, which is nice, but storytelling is storytelling. Again, you can't, I don't think it's a good idea to just say, well, because Christ once fed the poor, we don't need to feed the poor or do anything to feed the poor or give them food, material food, because there's a story out there that says that food was given to these poor people in their need by a holy figure. Thus, I am no longer obligated to do good. So in many ways, there's a reason why we want an objective reality and not to rely on just metaphors and stories, because there's always a story made up by often desperate people or people in situations because they want hope or salvation, that there will be. that a divine figure will come to do this.
All mythological heroes.
So
That's
he wasn't born of a virgin then? So you're saying that Jesus was not born of a virgin?
I said, first of all, that I don't know how to mediate the fact value dichotomy in that case. I said the same thing about the resurrection.
It's not a value, it's a simple fact. I mean, did a man have intercourse with Mary and produce Jesus? That's a factual question. It's not a value question.
You must understand what you're being asked here, that even if you think that...
Okay. And Peterson said something rather interesting, which may be somewhat revelatory, is what is the value, or he said to some degree, let's go back a little.
Resurrection.
It's not a value, it's a simple fact. I mean,
I said, first of all, that I don't know how to mediate the fact value dichotomy.
I don't know how to mediate the fact value dichotomy. So something is either a fact or a value, or he's trying, like he doesn't know how to mediate or kind of understand or come to a resolution on the value of facts or a fact value statement, something like that. It's kind of hard to determine exactly what he's saying here, but it does reveal a certain problem here, is that facts only have value if they are useful for the story. This may be somewhat of a mean interpretation and an attack on him, which I'm willing to stand by to a certain degree, but it does seem to be that if the objective reality of fact, it only has value in its utility for my social and psychological and cultural use. And that is antithetical to Dawkins' approach, because facts have value unto themselves as being a fact, a representation of existence and reality. And if you have that, you can know real from fiction. You can separate out the real from other things. And this is a value. This is a value. Now that doesn't mean that the subjective or other things can't do anything, but it does seem to be somewhat deceptive, that the facts only have value in their use or their utility to the story. That's tricky.
In that case, I said the same thing about the resurrection.
it's not a value, it's a simple fact. I mean, did a man have intercourse with Mary and produce Jesus? That's a factual question. It's not a value question.
You must understand what you're being asked here, that even if you think that, say, the author of the biblical texts intended much more significance than a simple scientific analysis of events, Professor Dawkins is interested in scientific truth. That's the kind of truth that he's interested in. And even if you think it's irrelevant to the point of what the gospel authors were getting at, that first needs to be clarified before you can then begin actually uncovering what the stories are about. So I think Professor Dawkins is asking from a scientific perspective, and maybe you think that that scientific approach is wrong, but if you just take it for a moment, maybe this is how we find out that it is wrong. Let's take a scientific approach, ask the question, did this occur?
I think that it's inappropriate to use a question like that to attempt to undermine the validity of the entire.
Okay. This is a bit whiny on his part, and I'm not fond of this. So, and it's also hypocritical as hell, because again, the entire thing, he has multiple times with his comments and statements tried to undermine the scientific approach. That doesn't mean that his approach is better or worse. It shouldn't mean, and more importantly, it doesn't mean that the scientific approach is inappropriate. It's perfectly fine to approach this way. Again, he doesn't want to play soccer. Now, maybe what they're essentially saying, or trying to compromise, is saying, hey, Richard Dawkins right now wants to play a little soccer, just for a minute or two. After this, if you want, we will play some basketball. Don't use your feet, your hands. And then he's kind of trying to say, like, well, no. The only sport that should exist, that needs to exist right now, and especially even if it's not the only one that should exist, because it's hierarchically better It is the only one I'm willing to participate in is basketball. Now, he doesn't want to say that outright because that sounds petty and whiny, though he's getting pretty petty and whiny here, and seemingly frustrated because I don't understand why. As an intellectual, as somebody who's supposed to be, and this is again the pseudo-intellectual, I know why, because pseudo-intellectuals do not like to bite bullets. They do not like to admit any degree of what they see as fault because they see it as this battle, this don't give any inch, don't acknowledge them. The other team sucks. I don't care that their quarterback is objectively good or whatever. I'm still going to say he sucks and he's shit and he can't pass for anything because, and again, now it starts looking irrational. This is where the problem starts happening. It starts looking irrational. He refuses to engage. He only wants to engage in mythological and psychological and sociological and again fictional truth and metaphor and the subjective kind of truth. He only wants to engage with that, which fine, that's his level of expertise where he is. But I think it's only fair play. Richard Dawkins has at least dipped his toe a little bit here and there into acknowledging or working with to some degree the subjective and whatever experience. But again, I think the fairest statement, even if it's not fair to Richard Dawkins, if I'm doing the most fence sitting analysis here, is that both guys only want to talk about one or the other. Dawkins only wants to talk about scientific truth. Jordan Peterson only wants to talk about mythological kind of truth and or truth statements. So, but I'm still I'm afraid I'm siding against here because like again, as the moderator does quite nicely, and the moderator again, he might be willing to go into this because I actually have seen a video of his and he's also be willing to go in philosophical stuff. So he may pin later on Richard Dawkins about, hey, let's actually engage in the philosophy here and not just the scientific objective truth. He wants to talk about psychology right now. He wants to play basketball. We played footsie with our soccer for a bit, but now, or football. You're, not American and superior, but now's the time where we're playing basketball. Jordan Peterson's not.
This occur?
I think that it's inappropriate to use a question like that to attempt to undermine the validity of the entire, what would you say, deep mythological enterprise.
Well, suppose we weren't doing that. Suppose we were asking out of interest. Suppose that we were all here devout Christians, maybe even Jungian Christians, and we thought, this is interesting, over dinner.
And this is kind of thing, like, okay, this is also working backwards. This story had an incredible amount of impact and sociological and cultural relevance. Ergo, it must be there's some kind of sacredness to that. So trying to undermine this by looking at it through different lenses is inappropriate and wrong because, but it's like, well, hold on a second. Like that's literally, we've done this with, so stories can undermine other stories. And we've done this before with scientific facts to undermine other stories and narrative things. But when it comes to this particular mythological thing, it's inappropriate. And again, maybe he's not meaning that in a moralistic standpoint. Maybe he's just meaning that in a kind of weird factual statement, is that again it's like bringing in data that is not relevant to this discussion, perhaps. But even then, it just seems the unwillingness to play is really getting me. Again, this is a problem I see with pseudo-intellectualism.
Do you think it really happened, like scientifically? Would your answer just be, I don't know?
And again, as he's kind of bringing up here, is like this, okay, maybe this is still kind of like, again, I don't want you to, there's just a kind of a weird cowardice of, you refuse, even let's just say, you stake out a position to where you have to believe the scientific truth of the Immaculate Birth. Let's just say you stake out a position to where, or a position to where you have to ignore all science when it comes to certain things. That it's simply invalid to use this in this moment. So, sounds strange to me, but fine. Okay. Even then, it just strikes me as the epitome of cowardice to not play, to not risk anything, and not to pretend. And again, it's somewhat, again, from a, even from a more subjective thing, it's somewhat almost narcissistic and almost like sociopathic or weird, because you're not even willing to pretend for a moment to be somebody else, to sit in their shoes, to have empathy, to practice empathy, sympathy, or have perspective in any way that is different from your own. You're not even willing to pretend for a moment that those things exist or whatever. And it's just from an argumentation standpoint, from a logical standpoint, from a intellectual, inquisitive standpoint, that is just so close-minded.
Yes.
And you wouldn't consider it, I mean, it's not an inappropriate question to ask, just on a point of interest.
Right.
Did this really occur? And I think so often people are asking you that, and especially given the context of this conversation, scientifically, would your answer just be, I don't know?
Yes.
And you wouldn't consider it, I mean,
I don't know. And again, it's one of those things where, I'm sorry, this is one of the worst things that can happen in intellectualism. This is your brain is stuck. Your information has spelled that calcified. It has been so frozen, so stuck, so calcified. You have dug your heels so much that you're going to say, I don't know, which is a statement, which is a position, as much as you might want to say. It's not some kind of third way or whatever. You know, sorry, it is kind of a yes or no question. You're trying to find this third way to say, I don't know. And it's just kind of like, well, dude, because you have a daughter and she's pregnant, you do not conceive in your mind. If I were to ask you right then and there, you hear your daughter walks up to you, he has a daughter, and daughter walks up to Jordan Peterson and says, "Hey Dad, I'm pregnant." The idea that she has been immaculately impregnated, that she will now be participating in an immaculate birth wherein there was no father. She was just walking down the street and a light hit her and she's now fucking pregnant with child. That did not occur to you. What's going to occur to him, or what's going to be a rational thought he's going to have, is, who is the father? And if she's young enough, I think she's an adult woman at this point. But again, if she was like a 14-year-old girl and she walked up to Jordan Peterson and say, "Hey Dad, I'm pregnant. Here's the pregnancy test." His thought isn't going to be, "Wow, Jesus Christ, wow, God and the Trinity has blessed my child with an immaculate birth." He's going to see, who is the son of a bitch who just had sex with my 14-year-old daughter, because I need to find that guy and put a hurt on him. Dishonest. This is when you become so calcified and so stuck, you know you have an answer, one way or the other. And maybe the answer is even, yes, I do believe it happened. Fine. Fucking stake that out. Have some goddamn courage and conviction in yourself. And again, I'm someone who is very open to somebody saying, I don't know. I say it all the time. I don't know shit. I'm dumb as hell about a lot of things. Truly, truly dumb. And ignorant, I would certainly say, and just lacking of knowledge. But that doesn't mean that if somebody asks me, I might say, look, I don't really know. I don't know if there's possibilities of this having a scientific things. I don't know how God materially works in an objective material sense. I believe he exists, but I don't know how it works. So I don't know from a biological sense how God works, how his presence works in here. But I believe it does happen. So yes, I believe that this happened. I don't know. I do not understand God's biology. I don't understand how God influences or interacts in a biological manner. But I do believe this happened. Stake out your fucking post. That's a perfectly acceptable way to elaborate on, look, I don't know. I don't know if this 100% happened. My instinct is to say yes, it did, based upon the belief system, based upon what I do know. But I acknowledge that there's a big gap in knowledge. From a scientific standpoint, there's a big gap in my knowledge. I don't know how this happened. Now you might then say, well, then why do you believe this? And maybe we can go on back on the belief, and we can turn this back around into the importance of believing in mythology and believing. I don't know, but this anti-intellectual pursuit, this unwillingness, even, or you could do the opposite. It's like, look, I believe in the value of the story. I believe in all of these things, but from a scientific standpoint, I'm not sure if it actually happened. Like, if I'm just looking at this from a scientific standpoint, I would say it's unlikely that it happened based on the evidence. But because of my belief in God, I do believe that, again, we can circle back around. Maybe it did happen, and I simply don't know the biological reality of God. But if you're going to ask me right now, based on the evidence that I have, from just a scientific, woman in front of me is pregnant. How did she become pregnant? Do I think it happened through immaculate things? I'm just going to say no. I do not know. I don't know. But I would probably lean more towards no than to yes. No, there was no immaculate birth.
It's not an inappropriate question to ask, just on a point of interest.
Right.
Did this really occur? And I think so often people are asking you that, and especially given the context of this conversation, we've heard everything that you're saying about metaphor and myth, but because the question is still then being asked, did it really happen? You know that that's what you're being asked, and the way you just so easily said yes, I wonder why you struggle to do that in so many other circumstances.
I think because I don't look at the situation the same. The way that Dr. Dawkins and I look at the situation are really quite different, and at many, many, many levels.
Yeah, well,
So even on the meme question, for example, like I know the literature on the history of religious ideas. I see how these ideas have battled across millennia in a manner that is very reminiscent to me of the same sort of claim that Dr. Dawkins is putting forward with regards to meme. I know that literature. Dr. Dawkins doesn't know that literature. And it's very difficult for me to communicate from within the confines of that literature because it's extensive and deep. And we're dealing with things that we don't understand the relationship between metaphoric truth and value predicated truth and factual truth. We don't understand that. It's a big problem.
well, we may, when he says understanding, what he was trying to say is we don't have the absolute 100%, but there are quite a lot of theories that have some degree of validity and some degree of predictive quality in the relationship to these things. So the idea that we don't know is a bit too much hyperbole. We don't know with 100% certainty, but we have good guesses.
We cannot, there's no evidence whatsoever from the scientific perspective that we can orient ourselves in the world merely in consequence of the facts.
Sure.
And that's a fact. And it's a fact that's been detailed out in great detail in the last 60 years by people from a variety of different disciplines. We have to prioritize the facts. That's a value hierarchy. There may be true and false ways of prioritizing facts, but you can't determine the truth or falsehood of the way that you prioritize facts
Yes.
by making reference to the facts. That's a big problem.
Okay, let's talk about that as perhaps a slight detour here, because I think we do need to come back to this Christ resurrection thing. But Professor Dawkins, would you say that underlying the scientific enterprise is a fundamentally unscientific assumption? You can make scientific investigations in the world, but in order to do so, you need to choose what to prioritize. You need to choose what to investigate. You also need to value the truth. You need to have a value and a motivation for doing it in the first place. Those kinds of things cannot themselves be scientifically justified. And so does the scientific enterprise have an unscientific assumption of the space?
I suppose it does. I mean, I think that maybe just be Jordan and Richard, by the way. I think that Jordan prioritizes myth and I prioritize fact. And I think myth is kind of vaguely interesting, but it's not the be-all and end-all of my life. I think it's somewhat secondary to scientific fact, the sort of facts that tell us how old the universe is, how old the world is, the history of life, the engineering achievement.
So again, the moderator rephrased a lot of the gobbledygook of the bit of the rambling by Peterson. It wasn't too bad, but rephrased it to where that's a really good question. Is again like is because you can't have like the factual. There is no like
underlying the scientific enterprise is a fundamentally unscientific assumption.
So again, you know, how we choose what to examine and how we evaluate some of our what the scientific facts that we get, how we evaluate them, that there is an underlining unscientific assumption before the science done. Before the science, there is an unscientific assumption or a certain assumption. Oftentimes, maybe not 100%, but oftentimes there is an unscientific assumption that happens before the science. And that leads into kind of more the mythological and or subjective existence. And again, there are the idea that the subjective exist may be seen as a fact, but again, we're kind of using the two words as fact. It's different whether it's subjective fact or objective fact. And both can be analyzed and acknowledged. But but it does seem like part of the reason why I think Dawkins is somewhat dismissive of this, because of both his background, but also the thing that good science often does is science also is not unaware of this. Is that good science, especially advancing over the past, 100 years, 50 years, 60 years, 70 years, 80 years, whatever, is oftentimes acknowledging and aware of its cultural potential biases, and thus is going, okay, well, we have this fact, but what is this fact actually revealing? We have a certain amount of meaning that we're trying to generate from this. Is this meaning essential, as in it is arising from this fact as a perfect truth? This is what it is, or is it arising from our perspective of this, an interpretation of this fact? What is the fact actually telling us? What is the fact not telling us? So this is a good summation here.
You can make scientific investigations in the world, but in order to do so, you need to choose what to prioritize. You need to choose what to investigate. You also need to value the truth. You need to have a value and a motivation for doing it in the first place. Those kinds of things cannot themselves be scientifically justified.
I mean, I think that maybe just be Jordan and Richard, by the way. I think that Jordan prioritizes myth and I prioritize fact. And I think myth is kind of vaguely interesting, but it's not the be-all and end-all of my life. I think it's somewhat secondary to scientific fact, the sort of facts that tell us how old the universe is, how old the world is, the history of life, the engineering achievements of landing a spacecraft on a comet, These are the things that science can do. And as I said, the predictions of quantum theory, to come back to that, the predictions of quantum theory, which are verified to a sufficient number of decimal places that it's equivalent to predicting the width of North America to 1 hair's breadth. Now, that is, however difficult quantum theory is to understand, that is what you can get from quantum theory. Now, the mysteries of the Bible, if they are mysteries, aren't in the same league. I mean, they just don't cut it.
Okay. So, again, that's not the worst I've seen of some degree of looking at that, the Trump X-Men. Oh God, I do so very much. The fact that he's putting Trump, sorry, I'm looking right here. He's putting Trump as Professor Xavier. But not really. I don't know. Like I just don't understand how you can kind of. And that's also the issue that I frequently have that makes me very suspect. That when somebody can purport themselves to be a reasonable individual, but then they clearly, either for memes or for some kind of weird sports team things, they just have this absolute blind spot. I think Trump is the worst person ever to exist. Of course not. I may speak in hyperbole here and there, and I'm sure he's doing some hyperbole, but the reality of Trump is just not even close to anything that many of the alt-right, the center-right, the dark web individuals want to do. Anyway, that's neither. But again, it's not a bad conversation. I think the moderator did a great job helping to jump in there. So we may do a full analysis of this at a later point. The entire debate that will probably take me days to do, but at least this section here we went through, so I can report back my findings next season. But overall, not a bad conversation, but it is there are tendencies within Jordan Peterson to be fairly pseudo-intellectual, and not particularly good at engaging in the game of intellectual debate and understanding. Dawkins is a little bit is not great with it either. He can sometimes he's somewhat overly pedant, overly focused just on scientific fact and doesn't engage in the mythology or whatever happening a little bit there. But based just on this, I would say this is some evidence. This is one of Jordan Peterson's, at least he's a bit more controlled here. He's a bit less manic. I've seen him in some other interviews relatively recently, where he is really really unhinged. Like it's really bad, and again, it is not just bad, but it's just there's this rage, anger, and extremely uncharitable nature, um, and a need to destroy the woke mind virus bullshit that I find is unhelpful and anti progress, anti development, anti learning, um at best. At best, it is just the utterly wrong approach if you want people to learn and understand things. That's at best. At worst, it's just straight up pseudo-intellectual demagogue bullshit. But we're going to go ahead and end the stream there. We started a little late and we're ending slightly early, but we managed to get through the video in some appropriate amount of time. I'll probably be posting it up within a day or so. And then we'll try to get back to games maybe tomorrow, maybe on Wednesdays and Thursdays. We'll do some gaming or continue do some React content. We might do that. But again, we're mostly covered through the. There was another Warren Smith video that I going to look at, but I might not look at that. I'll see what I can find that might be a better showing of that, or a better contention. But if anyone has any recommendations for pseudo-intellectual or issues of you're thinking, hey, I wonder, is this good and fair and interesting debate and actually engaging with these topics, I'd like to see input from, again, an English professor on as far as the language, rhetoric, and overall argumentation and analysis of that, whether it's a debate or a specific performance, a topic being discussed, an individual and their catalog. I'm up for it. I'm fine. I'm up for that. I'll always find my own stuff and bring it up to your guys' attention, what I find interesting. These last two were brought up to me by a student, and did them. Do something else next time. But until then, thank you for being here. Thank you for hanging out. Make sure to like and subscribe if you can, and maybe follow me on Twitch and wherever else you can find me. I do have a Substack that I am trying to finish up an article to post to. I have like 6 of them I started and I'm working on. So we're going to be posting a lot more frequently to the Substack, but I kind of screwed myself by starting a bunch of them and then realizing I need to actually finish one of them to post. But I keep getting distracted on working on them at the same time, not conducive to good activity. But we'll fix that. But thank you all for being here. Thank you for hanging out. And until next time, and as always, I hope you have a good one.